This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together comprise our third and final lecture on categorical logic. In this lecture, we'll continue to pursue our goal of increasing the power of our logical system while trying to minimize any increases in complexity, trying to get the maximal trade-off of cost to benefit. It's not unfair to characterize one urge of a good logician as an inferential megalomania. That is, you want to be able to incorporate as many valid argument forms in your logic as possible. But you also have to be a good engineer. You want to buy those increases in power at a minimum cost of increasing complexity, always trying to maximize that trade-off between ease of use and learning and power of the system. We'll do that by adding one premise to our arguments so that we'll now be dealing with direct inferences, but we'll also be dealing with categorical syllogisms, 3-line arguments in which we have 2 standard form categorical statements as premises and a single categorical statement as our conclusion. We'll begin the lecture by examining the structure of these arguments. We'll talk about how the predicate term of the conclusion is called the major term, and it will appear in the first premise, called the major premise. The subject of the conclusion will be called the minor term, and it will appear in the second premise, called the minor premise. We'll introduce a third term that appears in both premises, called the middle or the bridging term, and then we'll specify a set of rules for formulating standard form categorical syllogisms. We'll also identify the figure. The figure is just a number that allows us to identify the relative position of the middle or bridging term in each of the premises. Is it in the subject or predicate slot of that first premise, the major premise, and is it in the subject or predicate slot of that second premise, the minor premise? The figure will give us a single number that tells us the relative positions. We'll also introduce the notion of a mood. The mood is just the letter names of our standard form categorical statements as they appear in a standard form syllogism. So the letter name of the major term, the letter name of the minor term, and then the letter name of the conclusion. We'll see that you can reconstruct the argument form from the mood and figure alone. And in fact, if you were learning categorical logic in, say, the Middle Ages, you would only get the figure and the mood, and you would have to memorize lists of mood and figure that were valid in Aristotelian logic. Fortunately, we have an effective decision procedure. So we'll modify our effective decision procedure to handle 3 classes. We'll use a premise diagram and a conclusion diagram. We'll compare them after entering in what it takes to make both of the premises true on the premise diagram and what it takes to make the conclusion true on the conclusion diagram. And we'll be able to evaluate our categorical syllogisms for both Boolean and Aristotelian validity. We'll finish this lecture by going through and practicing that effective decision procedure on a number of examples. Let's take a look at a standard form categorical syllogism. We'll notice that the major term, the predicate of the conclusion, is also in the first premise, the major premise. The minor term, the subject of the conclusion, is also in the second premise, the minor premise. And the 2 terms are related through a middle or bridging term that occurs in both premises. So the structure of our categorical syllogism is that we are relating our minor term to our major term. It's included in or excluded from that major term in virtue of their relationships to that middle or bridging term. We're now in a position to specify the rules according to which we can formulate standard form categorical syllogisms. All of these statements in a standard form categorical syllogism must be one of those 4 standard form categorical statements. The 2 occurrences of each term, the major, the minor, and the middle term, are to be identical in our standard form categorical syllogism. Each term must be used in the same sense throughout the argument as well. The order is major premise, minor premise, conclusion. The figure, as we mentioned, is a number that gives us the information about the relative position of the middle or bridging term in the major and minor premises. Since the relationship between the middle or bridging term and the major term and the minor term will determine the relationship that the major and minor term have to each other, the figure is a very important bit of information. As you can see, figure 1 has the middle or bridging term in the subject slot of the major premise, the first premise, and in the predicate slot of the second premise, the minor premise. Figure 2 has both middle terms in the predicate slot. Figure 3 has both middle terms in the subject slot, and figure 4 has the middle term in the major premise in the predicate slot and in the minor premise in the subject slot. Now, to help you remember where the relative positions of the middle or bridging term are for a given figure, we can use this shirt collar mnemonic device. Figure 1 is at an angle, subject of the major, predicate of the minor, just like the shirt collar would be. Figure 2 has the middle or bridging term in the predicate slot at the end, just as these 2's are at the end of one side of the shirt collar. Figure 3 has them at the beginning in the subject slot, just like it is at the beginning of that shirt collar. And figure 4 has the middle term in the predicate slot of the major premise, the first premise, and the subject slot of the minor premise, the second premise. So that shirt collar mnemonic device can help you make those associations between the figure number and the relative position of the middle or bridging term. Now, the mood just gives us the letter names for each of the standard form categorical statements that appear in our syllogism in the order in which they appear: the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. We can use the information in the figure and mood to reconstruct the logical form of the argument. We can do so like this. Suppose that we have a mood of EOI and a figure of 3. We can reconstruct the logical form of the argument as follows: that E is a universal negative standard form categorical statement, and so our quantifier is no, and our copula is R. We don't put any letters in yet because we don't know exactly where they go. That type O is a particular negative. It has some as its quantifier and R naught as its copula. But again, we don't know where the subject and predicate go in that second premise. Our conclusion is a type I statement. Sum S. Now we know the minor term is going to be in the subject slot, so I'll just use S for the minor term. R. We know that the major term is going to be in the predicate slot, so I'll use a P for the major term. Once we have those quantifiers and copulas in place for our first two premises, together with our conclusion, we can turn to that figure and use its information about the relative positions of the middle or bridging terms to finish off our reconstruction. Figure 3 has the middle or bridging term in the subject class of the major premise and the subject class of the minor premise, like so. Now that we know that, we know that the predicate of the conclusion, the major term, goes in the major premise, the first premise, and that the subject of the conclusion, the minor term, goes in the minor premise or the second premise. And that gives us our logical form from mood and figure. Let's try another example and see how we do. You might want to stop the video, try and do it yourself, and then start the video and see if what you did matches what I do. Once again, we use those mood letters to give us our quantifiers and copulas for each of the first two premises. Our type A is a universal affirmative, so our quantifier is all, our copula is R. Type E is a universal negative, so our quantifier is no, and our copula is R. Our O is a particular negative, that'll be our conclusion. We know that the conclusion has the minor term in the subject slot and the major term in the predicate slot, so we can write those in like so, and we get some S R naught P. Once we have our premise, quantifiers, and copula, and our conclusion written out, we can turn to the figure and use that to give us information about the relative position of those middle terms in these premises. Figure 4 has the middle or bridging term in the predicate slot of the major premise, the first premise, and in the subject slot of the minor premise, the second premise, like so. Now we know that the predicate of the conclusion, the major term, goes in the first premise, the major premise, and the subject of the conclusion, the minor term, goes in the second premise, the minor premise. And that is how we reconstruct the logical form of an argument from the mood and figure alone.